Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation. I apologize, I'm a little bit sore of the throat, so my voice will be a little bit strange, but I'm here. Let's begin. So I decided to focus on speech scrolls, and specifically how they represent sacred speech and authority, and the transmission of cosmic order in Mesoamerican art and poetry. Also, forgive me, there's a busy street right next to me, so you might be picking up some honking, whatnot. No worries. So this is a topic which has been an interest of mine for ever since we opened up Boone's Glorious Imperium, and we started looking at speech scrolls and the role of a leader as a speaker, and the ability to transmit authority and as a symbol of their authority. And so one of the key concepts that we're going to want to keep in mind during this presentation is the concept of coessences and the concept of the channeling of greater concepts or gods or deities through a specific person based on their birth, the circumstances of their birth, and also their class and the caste that they were born into, which allows for a permissibility in channeling that essence, at least during the Aztec period, the social stratified classification. So here's just an orienting slide. This is an image of a Tlatoani with his speech scroll. Sitting on a reed mat, which also symbolizes authority, and the speech scroll specifically note is curling downwards. Now, the argument that I'm making in this presentation is that a downward curling speech scroll represents an essential concept of speech and the capacity to engage in sacred speech, as opposed to sound scrolls, which we'll see a little bit later. So here we have a representation from the Codex Mendoza, and it's people, mothers and fathers engaging in a speech action. And it's a representation of the ancient world, the Huehuetlacatl, which is essentially a transmission of cosmic order, which accompanies life cycle events, and people are trained in them. So you have, for instance, with a midwife will have an exchange with parents over the naming of a child or the birth of a child, the ritual bathing of a child. When a child is admitted into an academy based on their class, there will be a handoff between the parents and the priests or the leaders of those houses, and they'll engage in a formal sacred rhetoric, which is a transmission of order. And so here we have the speech scroll denoting a cultural or traditional transmission, and it's authoritative speech. That this is how they have to do. And here we have, for instance, a 13-year-old boy carrying bulrushes and a 13-year-old girl making pottery. And then a 14-year-old boy down here fishing and a girl weaving. So here we begin to address the difference between speech scrolls and sound scrolls. And what I sort of noticed, and with the guidance of Professor Carrasco, you have this concept of you have speech scrolls which are not just curling downward, but are also inverted. So if you see here this first image, which is from the Codex Boturini, it documents the Aztec travel from Aztlan to a place where pronunciation is very hard for me, but where they received guidance from Huitzilopochtli, who you see here, his head with the hummingbird, and he is giving them instructions. Now, specifically, we know that this is not an essential concept of speech, but rather speech scrolls, because they're curling in different directions, or at least it's the argument that I'm trying to make. It's interesting that you would have a deity who is not only represented as a speaker, but is engaging in sound and engaging in speech. So it shows that maybe this differentiation applies not just to people, but also to avatars of deities. Then up on the top right, we have an image of a warrior from Teotihuacan, and this is very, very fascinating to me, because he has a speech scroll which is curling downward, coming from his mouth, symbolizing his capacity to channel and engage in authoritative speech, by my argument. And from his dart thrower here, there's spear thrower, he has a inverted speech scroll, a sound scroll, which is composed of a bunch of other inverted scrolls. So that almost seems like a conversation is emanating from his weapon of war. and that the capacity to do war is also a manifestation of speech, that he's speaking with his weapon across the battlefield, but it's not a formal speech. It's not a sacred speech necessarily. It's a dialogue that's happening. Then over here, in the bottom right corner, we have the image of a comet from 1537, and it is spewing out sound scrolls. Now, originally when I found this image, I thought this is before I had the differentiation in mind, which Professor Carrasco guided me in. We have this, what appeared to be an omen which was speaking and had the capacity to channel divine speech. But I was corrected that these are more than likely sound scrolls, and the pattern here is that there are inverted speech scrolls also there. So we have the difference between a downward curling scroll, which is speech as an essential concept, the ability to channel cosmic order through your voice, which became enshrined in authority and the autonomy that authority provides in the Aztec period, and then sound, so speech and action, sound. So here we have a very fascinating image in this way, and so the question I'm posing, what's the nature of speech? So over here, this is from the Mapa de Quahatinchan, sorry, pronunciation is terrible, in which Elizabeth Boone, in The Eagle's Nest, she postulates that that these are representing rituals immediately following the Aztec emergence from Chicomostoc and their journey eventually to Tenochtitlan, and that this passage represents the descent of the Chichimecs from a supernatural realm and onto the earth proper, the rituals that make this transformative movement possible. So I had to crop this image, but what is going on here is you have two pairs of Chichimecs, who we know that Chichimecs, their fur coats, who appear to be offering snakes in the form, which take the aesthetic form of a speech scroll, to the two Toltec lords who were guiding them. And so you have this ritual process. And I think that maybe because this is representing, to go off of Boone's postulation, that because this is representing a supernatural realm and the descent into the physical, that the speech scroll itself isn't so much as a metaphor, but is actually represented with what it is. So that, if that makes sense. So they're channeling a divine snake through their speech, and they're offering this speech, the sacred rhetoric, as an offering to these lords who have guided them. And it's a part of relationship. So this could indicate that speech itself has an identifiable divine quality in certain circumstances through certain essential channelings. And so the depictions are very similar in form, placement, and movement to the speech scroll. And this brings us into our next area of speech, the Tlamatinimi, the knowers of things, or the sages, who were trained in sacred rhetoric and language, and they received instruction in the Calmecacs, the academies of higher learning, which were patronized by Quetzalcoatl, the lord of the Toltecs. And we know that from the ancient word, the records that we have, that he was the patron, and that a lot of the word which was given over was directed towards him, and it was about a priest's interaction with Quetzalcoatl as the patron and him taking them in. And so we have this concept of sacred rhetoric being attached to Quetzalcoatl, and the ability to give a ritual offering with this sacred speech is attached to this god. So as I was going over the ancient word translated by Leon Portilla in Native Mesoamerican spirituality, I found this very, very interesting egalitarian sort of policy, which I think may be, part of the langue de Rey coming from Tolan, and perhaps originally from Teotihuacan, which we'll see a little bit later. So it says specifically that this priest would become a keeper of the god, and they named him Quetzalcoatl. And it didn't matter about his station in life. Though he were poor, though he were in need, though his father, his mother were the poorest of the poor, if he well carried out the way of life, the precepts of the priests, this one was taken, this one was given the name of Quetzalcoatl. There were two Quetzalcoatl priests. And not lineage was considered, only a good life. So we have this concept that it doesn't necessarily matter what caste a person is born into. If they follow the way of the god, they can transcend the social stratification and become a keeper of the god themselves. And there's also the concept of like, who are you to tell Quetzalcoatl where to manifest on the social hierarchy, you know? So we have this very interesting thing where Quetzalcoatl appears to be reaching in and completely disregarding the stratification of the Aztec. And this, to me, it makes a lot of sense. For instance, Tzoltlitzin Quetzalcoatl, he was known for invoking and inducing worship of the dual god Ometeotl, who a lot of the readings that I've said, they'll either say that he dwells in the 13th heaven or above the 12th heaven. And I think that there's a huge distinction between those two, because to say that they dwell in the 13th means that they're still part of a socially stratified universe, a cosmovision. Whereas if you say above the 12th, you're saying that the supreme deity is necessarily above hierarchy itself. So I'm going to be taking that interpretation for these next slides. So here we have a possible equality of invocation. So if we bear in mind that Quetzalcoatl is related to training of sacred rhetoric is used to make offerings to the gods, and sacred rhetoric can be used by people during certain circumstances, then we come to the question of poetry. So the flower song poets, they often mention offering of flowers to Ometeotl. There's always this concept that not a lot of other gods are mentioned. I think there's only a couple of times in a poetic exchange between the poet kings, but mostly poets being recorded, they're referring specifically to the Lord of the Near and Far, the sustainer of life, which Leon Portilla holds are just metonyms for Ometeotl. So we have these poets who, independent of their class, are capable of using speech to channel Ometeotl and to give offerings. And so I went looking through the Cantares Mexicanos to try and find instances where the poor and people who weren't necessarily rich or from a higher class were engaging in poetry, because a lot of the flower songs that we have come from Nezahualcóyotl and poet kings, and that makes a lot of sense. They would have the resources and the reputation to be recorded in their name. But here we have specifically, it's from another Sarotomi song, and it says, "To you the ever present, you the ever near, I call in sadness, and lay my sighs before your face." No, face, not feet. So it's a direct parallel relationship. "I'm wretched here on earth. I wail that I that am poor, I that am never touched by joy or riches." This is a poor person. Now, this is a peasant. "Adorn yourself with sad flowers, weeping flowers, and praise him. You will offer flower sighs to him, the ever present, to him, the ever near." So we have a poor person who's engaging in sacred rhetoric through a flower song in order to connect to this supreme God, which necessarily transcends hierarchy. So this is a transcendent experience. And we see another evidence of this. "I, the singer, support my song in heaven." So the singer is supporting a song in heaven. "Indeed, I take it from the sky dwellers." So there's that give and take. There's that channeling relationship, which reminds me of a poem which I love from Io Kwan, who essentially talks about the flower songs being channeled through a person. And he says that our inventiveness spoils their fragrance. Our longing and our inventiveness spoils their fragrance. To the effect that there is a noted disparity between the channel and the essence being channeling itself. But there's definitely a capacity to channel that's coming through in these flower songs. Think muses for a more Western orienting concept. And that brings us, so bearing all of that in mind, with the capacity with sacred speech potentially being connected to poetry, that you have a stratified measure of sacred speech, and then you have this transcendental speech of flower song. We see a totally remarkable fresco from Tepoztlán in Teotihuacan. And this is just utterly fascinating for me. I wish I could spend hours and hours just delving into this one mural. But for the sake of the scope of this presentation, what we have here is you'll see not just one speaker, but dozens and dozens of individuals, all of which with their own speech scroll, which is curling downward. And I think in this entire mural, from what I've seen, there's only one inverted speech scroll. So I'm not exactly sure what that means, but the common trope is that every single person engaging in life here has the capacity to channel with sacred rhetoric, with authoritative speech, with autonomy, with the speech scroll. And so there's some questions about what's the context of this. You have here a watery mountain, which could be Tzalokan, which is a paradise of sorts. Or I saw some other interpretations which were saying that essentially that this is an artist's representation of a Teotihuacan as a idyllic paradise, of a paradise of egalitarianism, which makes a lot of sense with a lot of the conversations that we were having in class, specifically regarding the sacking of Teotihuacan. Was it internal revolt? Was it external revolt? And if there was, in fact, a tension between the priestly class and the artistic class being the ones who would have made this, who were kind of rebelling against, an authoritarian order, we see the vision of the artists as Teotihuacan as an egalitarian society. We're not just the leaders, but everybody has equal access to the gods. Everybody has the access to craft their world through authoritative speech. Everybody has a voice. Every person is, in that sense, a priest, is connected to Quetzalcoatl. Or every man is a poet, capable of transcending hierarchy. And just some other notes here. We have remembrances of poets here. On the slopes of the mountain, we have red birds, which are often invoked in flower songs as well. Red birds and gold birds. And generally, we just have this beautiful vision of a autonomous and egalitarian access to the essential quality of speech, which would become an authoritative quality and a very, very closely guarded, socially stratified quality in the Aztec world. So I hope you enjoy. If you have any questions, please feel free to post on the discussion board. I know that this is a pretty involved presentation, and I hope I communicated it as clearly as possible. But thank you very much for taking the time.